Welcome back. It's time to get back to the presentations. John, thank you so much. That was fabulous. I'm still chuckling over some of those observations that you've made in the cards. I really have to look through my collection a little closer to see what else I can draw out of those little pieces of paper that I think I've got for one reason, but then you read the back and you've really got it for another reason altogether. So it's now time to get our second presenter, Peter Hiller. Peter is equally as passionate and knowledgeable about his subject, which is Joe Mora and his art. And in introduction, Peter is actually the Joe Mora Collection Curator for the Monterey Historical and Art Association, and has been enamored with the artistic genius of Joe Mora for over 25 years. With a background as a grade school art teacher and a love of the Southwest, Peter has found wonderful connections with Joe Mora's life and career. Married and the father of two grown men, Peter loves bringing the world of Joe Mora to a wider audience through speaking, exhibiting, and writing, including penning the biography of The Life and Times of Joe Mora, iconic artist of the American West, which he had published through the Book Club of California and Gibbs Smith. So Peter, bring us into Joe Mora's world. Thank you.
And thank you very much, David. I appreciate the introduction. I would also like to thank Mary Beth and Barbara, and at the end, Mike, for your participation in this presentation and helping make it possible. I am a newbie to the organization. I'm honored to have been invited to participate, and I hope you enjoy the fact that I was invited. I want to begin by putting Joe's world into a context that involves my involvement with it. And when in 1981, my wife and I moved from Southern California, Los Angeles area, to the Monterey Peninsula. And it was time for us to get out of the big city and into a smaller town. And we both came up here as teachers. We both had teaching jobs, and that was our professional careers preceding that move, but then also for 35 years after we got here. Shortly after moving here, I discovered the two images that are on the screen now. They were in a drawer in my school, and I, as the art teacher, and that was my career, was teaching grade school art, 1st through 8th grade. I was fascinated by both these images, and they were, the graphic design component of them, the subject matter I loved. I had a pre-existing interest in the Southwest Native American cultures. I grew up playing cowboys when I was a boy, so the subject matter was fascinating. The artistic component was wonderful. The historic and factual information was fascinating. And I soon thereafter discovered that Joe Mora had spent a number of years, about the last third of his life, on the Monterey Peninsula. And it's basically where he raised his family as well. So slowly but surely, I became curiouser and curiouser, as Al would have said, about this person. And I realized, I discovered a little booklet that had been authored by Josh Grandow and Don Short that was titled Collecting Joe Mora. And they were really the first people to put together an index of some of Joe's accomplishments. And so that was a wonderful stepping stone for me, and it helped me identify more material of Joe's and also make connections in this community. So slowly but surely, I started to see more and more of Joe's work. And then the light bulb went off, and I realized I was so infatuated with this person and his creativity that I wanted to see a lot of it. And I realized that the way to do that was going to be to organize a museum exhibition of his work. Well, I'm not bashful necessarily, so I approached the director of our local art museum, the Monterey Museum of Art. I knew him through previous projects. I proposed the idea of a Joe Mora retrospective, and he didn't think about it very long until he said yes. So this was the mid-1990s. And through that, and through the fact that this is a small town, I was introduced to Joe Mora Jr., Joe's son. And that began a friendship that lasted for the rest of his life. And Joey lived to be 98 years old. And I knew him for about the last 20 years of his life. And I knew with this exhibit, I wanted to go forward with his blessing. And he gave that to me. He gave me access to his collection, and the rest kind of has become history. So there's to small towns and people, everybody knowing each other, which ended up being a wonderful situation. I also should preface this by saying that I am not particularly a collector of Joe Mora material. I felt like I wanted to be sure that there was no perceived conflict of interest between my access to this material and my potentially collecting it, buying, selling it. And so I really have avoided that. Having said that, a few things have come my way for one reason or another, but my interest has really been in the story, the research, and just celebrating what I consider to be a very creative life. I want to share with you both of his families. The image on the left depicts his father on the far left with the white goatee, his mother, Laura. That's Joe laying down next to the dog, and his brother, Luis, in the background, and in the hammock is Luis's wife, our fiance at the time. Now, fascinating component of this whole story is that Joe's father was a trained classical sculptor, and his brother was a classical painter, and they were both successful in their own worlds as far as their creativity. And one of the keys to this picture is Laura, Joe's mom, who kept all of Joe's material from the time he was a young boy, and you're going to see examples of that. The picture on the right is Joe's family, his immediate family, his wife, Grace, and his two children. That's Joey with the overalls on, and Joey's sister, Patty, next to him. Well, Grace carried on that tradition of keeping the archive. And without the work of the moms, both these mothers, I wouldn't be speaking to you right now. It was an absolute blessing that they had the foresight to, from the time Joe was a little boy, they kept the accomplishments of his artwork. And here's one example. So picture Joe, I should say Joe was born in 1876 and he passed away in 1947. But the image on the left is a drawing he did in grade school. Map making was part of a geography class, so it was not unusual to do that. But here is his picture of Europe, an extended part of Europe that he did probably in the 5th or 6th grade. And eventually the image on the right is the flyleaf of a book and probably the first published map that Joe did. And you're going to see how maps fit into the equation as we go along. 3 examples of Joe's work as a child, and I apologize for the one in the upper right being somewhat gruesome, but it does depict his ability as an artist, as do the other sketches. And this would have been work that he did as a child, which is amazing. And his mom, again, kept these 10-cent notebooks that Joe filled not only with illustrations, but also with stories. He wrote story after story about what I will describe as cowboys and Indians. I mean, it was a theme that fascinated him, and he referred to it repeatedly. He then, he does go to art school as a child, but I would propose that his father was his most important teacher. He loved working with his father, and he learned a lot as a result of that. Having an older brother who was also artistically talented also rubbed off on Joe. But Joe eventually, his father was very specifically a sculptor, his brother a painter, although he did do some graphic work as well. But Joe's career just blossomed in all mediums. And I think you're going to see a sense of that as we go through these slides. And this is really not intended so much as a biography, although I hope you glean biographical information as we go along, but because I did really want to emphasize the ephemeral components of his career. And this is probably the first piece that I know of that would have been commercially published. And this was done in 1903, as you can see. It was a calendar. And here are a couple of the monthly pages. Also, take a note at the kind of the character of the illustrations. To my eye, there's a roughness to these, not so much in terms of technique, but kind of in the way he decided to depict the characters. And you're going to see it change as he gets older and as he becomes a father, I will contend. So he's working. He gets hired by the Boston Herald. These are in the days before photographs were a part of a daily newspaper. So the editor would send Joe out to the scene of the news. He would do drawings. He would then come back and those would become the illustrations in the paper. And this was his first really paid job that created income for him. That led to Joe, well, eventually traveling west. He spent about the first 25 years of his life on the East Coast of the United States. I'll back up one moment and say he was actually born in Uruguay, as was his brother. His father had moved there from Spain. His father was Catalan. He met his mother, Joe's mother, in Uruguay. She was French by nationality. And so Joe grew up in a multicultural, multinational family, which I think adds to his intrigue as a person. He came west. He had a sense that the American West was changing. He wanted to see the Native American cultures before they disappeared. In fact, the cultures were changing. Population migration was shifting from the east to the west. And Joe had a sense of that and he wanted to see it firsthand. The image here on the right is a sketch he did while during a period of time when he rode the El Camino Real in California. He followed the Mission Trail that Portola had used. He had Crespi's diary with him and was stopping at what he felt like were at the same campsites that the Portola expedition had followed. Joe took the photograph on the left and oftentimes would take photographs, use that as the reference for the artwork that he would do. He then spent almost 3 years living with the Hopi and the Navajo. And during that time, there was not so much ephemeral material created then as there was deeply important artwork. And that's another chapter in the story about Joe Mora that I'm going to ask you to research or to go look on YouTube because it's a fascinating chapter. But I'm not going to focus on it today. But during that time, he decided, in fact, he wrote home and said, if I don't leave now, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here. And I should add that he learns to speak Hopi, he learns to speak Navajo, he lives in their communities, he is accepted by them, he's given honorary names, he participates in ceremonies. He went with what I call an open heart, and they sensed that and they accepted his presence while he was there. He gets an offer for a job, again from the Boston Herald. This is in 1907, and the offer is to do a weekly comic. He titled it Animaldom. It would show up every Sunday over the course of a year. And these now are two examples of those. That was a full page devoted to his cartoons. And this now, of course, has become ephemeral material. The piece on the right is actual page from the newspaper, as is the one on the left. The one on the right is currently on display at Ohio State University. They have an extensive cartoon collection there, and this happens to be part of a collection of an exhibit that's on display now. I should also point out that Joe does not just the illustrating, but he also writes the text and the limericks that are part of each of these weekly pieces. And again, this starts to produce income for Joe. It continues as he was doing some book illustrating while he was back east, and then also his work for the Boston Herald. It's also at this time that he gets married. And he had a sweetheart in the San Jose part of California. And that was the big event really almost immediately after he left Arizona. So he gets to California. That's where he's going to spend the rest of his life. And he starts working again. Well, he has learned so much about the American West that it becomes the subject matter of his artwork, one of the main recurring themes. These are also here not only to depict his art, but because they're all postcards. And postcards are kind of essential ephemeral material. And that these have also become really rich resource in terms of when some of the actual cast bronzes have been produced. And then we have the reference of what these were. These would have been plaster before they were cast. So they're good research material. Joe spends several years in the central part of California. He's up in the San Francisco Bay Area. World War I breaks out, and he decides he wants to serve his country. It's very important to him. So we're moved forward a little to the late teens, 19 teens. Joe goes into training. He's San Rafael, Northern California, ends up in Kentucky. He is considerably older than the rest of the people that were in the training program. And he, again, as an artist, does what he can, but he was so busy in the training program that he really did very little artwork during that period of time. This is the cover of a single fold brochure. These are the other two illustrations in it. So this is something he produced while at Camp Zachary Taylor. And I'm not going to try to follow a chronology any longer, but I want to share the different aspects of Joe's publishing and his ephemeral collection, ephemeral material. 3 different versions of stationery that Joe collected, or created, excuse me, and I have been collected. And then he starts doing map work. Well, you saw the first published flyleaf of a map. These efforts come right around this. The first one on the left comes about the same time. It's about 1927. And then the one on the right is 1945. And Joe, he works in the style of what are referred to as pictorial maps. He wasn't the only one doing pictorial maps, and there are some wonderful comparisons to be made between other cartographers who worked in that same style, but Joe's stand out, and not necessarily as the best, but they are distinctive. And if you compared Joe's pictorial maps to other cartographers working in that style, I think you could, they all had their own slight twist and their own style to them. And so it's pretty easy to separate who did which. And but it proved to be very important to the family. Joe's son, Joey, really, in my mind, was his father's business manager and would encourage Joe to do certain projects. And these maps, of which there are several others, would help the family get through the Depression. Because interestingly enough, when times as hard as they were, people were still willing to spend 50 cents to buy one of these maps. And it created enough income for the family to keep food on the table and clothes on their back during those hard times. We see Joe working on one of them in its probably second version. He often would start in pencil, then go to ink, and then would have the color added. And the image on the right is my favorite compass rose of his, as it celebrates the arts. And in fact, to the left of that, I would contend is Patty and Joey, his kids, with their 2 family dogs. And this is a detail. And then if you go a little lower, that's probably Joe at the home, at their home. And that was a detail that happened to be in Pebble Beach, California, which is where they lived at the time. This is a detail from a larger map that depicts Carmel by the Sea. And because this is all about travel, and as an ode to John and his presentation, well, of course, Joe did a poster featuring Graceline, which was a company that had cruise ships. And this is Joe's piece that he did for a trip that he actually took with his family through the Western Hemisphere. It was Joe would barter his artistic efforts. I can't emphasize how wonderful his ability was to, again, keep food on the table and clothes on his family's back. And he did it in any way he could think of. He sold work that he created. He worked on commissions. He bartered. Well, he also traveled, and he would have done this kind of advertising work for the Graceline company and in exchange for passage on the boat with his family. And so they did at least one Western Hemisphere cruise, and then they did a second that went around the world. So, and what we're, again, through the blessings of Joe's mother and wife, we not only do we have a copy of the printed poster, but we also have the original pen and ink drawing, which now is in the collection of David Rumsley map collection. So the piece on the left is a singular piece that Joe did as sort of a thank you to E.T. Ford, the president of the Panama Mail. Joe loved pirates. You can see the cruise ship there. And then on the right is a book that Joe proposed for the Graceline company. And it was Joe's idea to create a journal with prompts for the passengers. Well, and so here we have, and this is just so cool to have in your hand, but this is a book that Joe made as an example of what the finished product could be. So this is actually a piece of leather that he used for the binding. It's pen and ink on the cover. And if you open it up, you go through his rough sketches of what the book could be. So this is an example of the finished book. The title changed, and the company was so taken with the book that they bought out the entire publication and gave it then to their passengers. And I want to indulge me to read something because this relates perfectly with John's presentation. And who knew that these were going to overlap like they did our two talks, but they do in a wonderful way. So here is an example of what this looks like. So Joe would create a prompt and then leave space for the passengers to fill it in. And when you find these, half the time you find a blank book, and then other times you find copies that people had actually filled out. But I want to just read to you the romance page, okay? And here's the page of pages. In most diaries, this should be well filled. Some may remain blank even though they should be filled, as for example, married men traveling alone, etc. Of course, far be it from us to state there are no mortals in existence without romance in their souls, but you know how it is. Moonlit seas, carefree hours, a nook by the lifeboat, dreamy dance music, you can never tell. Up sneaks old Dan Cupid, twang, twang, a couple of bullseyes, write it down, for it may be the future meal ticket or ball and chain to be. It's all worth recording, even if only for future evidence. So, here are a couple of images from inside of the book. So it was as if Joe had actually he had been on the entire trip, and then he does, where all the stops at the ports of call were, he would do a drawing like the one on the right. He would write some text about it, and oftentimes also added small little maps. Not to be left behind are a beautiful map of Los Angeles that Joe did, and an unfinished map of Catalina. So Catalina Island is one of the wonderful insights into Joe's process, because this was a pencil drawing on tracing paper. And in my mind, it was not finished. And I can only speculate as to maybe it was a commission that fell through, or Joe ran out of time to finish it. But I have the feeling it's about 80% done in this state, which would have been the first effort by him, pencil, and then it would have had ink added, and then it would have been turned into color. There's no date on that, but there are enough sort of moments on the map that indicate where it was. The Chicago Cubs baseball team is depicted. There are buffalo there, which were brought over by a movie production company. So if I ever spent the time, you could kind of narrow down, I think, where the exact date. I include Los Angeles because it's just so bright and wonderful. And there we go. He also did 3 of his carts about the national parks. He did Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, and also Yellowstone. But what I love about the Yosemite is that there's a lot of little vignettes are autobiographical, including the family there at the first view, which could have been Joe's family because he did take them there years later. Originally gone, 3. And that's Joe in his wagon with his traveling companion, and being pulled by their 2 mules, Tom and Jerry. And so there's a lot of wonderful little vignettes. I love the fact that Joe does these visual puns, you could see with Bridal Veil Falls and Mirror Lake. And Joe would, when he did this trip, I mentioned he'd gone on the El Camino Real ride. When he then went to Arizona, he did that on the buckboard wagon with Honey, his traveling companion, and they stayed in Yosemite for about 2 weeks. So and Joe kept a journal, and he also took photographs, as you can see in the figure above Nevada Falls. So there are a lot of little biographical vignettes. This is an advertising piece that was in the Los Angeles Times, just purporting visitors go to Yosemite. Joe's art showed up on the AAA Motorland magazine cover. So, and what I love too is that the photograph was by Ansel Adams. And then in more recent years, Joe's art was used. This is a flyer for an exhibit up in Mariposa, and a current exhibit that happens to be at the California Historical Society, again depicting a segment of Joe's Yosemite cart. His work ended up on the cover of Arts and Architecture magazine. Postcards. These postcards were of murals that Joe did. So we're getting to see the artwork efforts, the art efforts that Joe did, but then also they show up as cartoons. Well, they show up as postcards for the Drake Wilshire Hotel, which was in San Francisco. It's no longer there. And fortunately, these murals have been found, cleaned, and cared for and are on display in Pacific Grove, California, and they are spectacular. Joe did a couple of different menus for the hotel. This is the second one. And of course, it's wonderful to see the cost of things back in the day. And paramount to his career was his membership in the Bohemian Club in San Francisco. And that's Joe there. This is, I probably shouldn't even be showing this because it is a very private club. But in any case, Joe met some very important people as a result of his membership. He knew how important it could be when he came to live permanently in California. And it proved to be the case. So he found patrons. His work is found throughout the club building in San Francisco. He would then also, oh, wait, I'm going to go back. He would also go to their gatherings in the summer and create artwork there. It was very important to him. And he would get, he was living in the San Francisco area. He got to know people through the Bohemian Club. Here is a brochure advertising the Canterbury Hotel. Again, we switch subject matter now. Joe is, depicting the Chaucer's Tales as an advertising piece. And can you imagine, this is a threefold piece, and they've given an entire side of the brochure to Joe's artwork. It's not all about the rates of the rooms and the address and how to find it and pictures of what the rooms look like, but they celebrate Joe's work by depicting his art. Here's a smaller, more modest piece, just a little card. And then a second brochure for a different hotel, the Maurice. And what's kind of interesting is to see the image on the left are the original paintings that Joe did for those two brochures. And you can compare the Maurice on the left with the Maurice on the right and just see how it's changed. It didn't change that much. It was basically color changes, but it's, just in terms of process, it's wonderful to see kind of the beginning and then the end. And then again, here we go, we open it up and it's all about medieval times. And I don't doubt for a minute that Joe also wrote the text as well as did the artwork. And here's a modern version of that same image. The Canterbury Hotel is still there. They no longer have Joe's murals in place. Joe did the work on this, which was $1. It was a script that was issued, and he did the artwork on this. These have become collector's items. They had stamps on the back, and if you went to the merchants and you filled up the back with stamps, they would give you it, you could turn it in for $1. Book plates, one for each child. Joe was very conscientious about treating his children equally. So if he would do something for one, he inevitably would do something similar or equal for the other. Of original pen and ink for the Hotel Del Monte of potential wine label. I don't have evidence that it was ever printed as a wine label, but we do have this, this original drawing that would have been something to show the manager with the thoughts of them then printing it. Another fancy piece that he did for the Hotel Del Monte, this was obviously an invitation to a New Year's Eve party. And if you start on the left, that's it folded closed. And then you open it up and you see what's in the middle. And then the piece on the right is the back of the image. Joe became very good friends with S.F.B. Morris, who owned the Hotel Del Monte. And that connection, I'm sure, started through the Bohemian Club, but they would become good friends. And Morris hired Joe a lot, quite often to do work like this for him, including a cocktail recipe book that Joe illustrated. And a series of menus. This was, I think, I'm going to give Morris credit for this, but it was kind of genius. He had Joe do 12 different drawings featuring the history of Central California, from indigenous people all the way up to what we can call modern times. Again, this is back in the 30s or 40s. Those images then were used for menus. They were used on posters, but they were also used as advertising. So here is a copy of Fortune magazine from 1934, which was more popular on the East Coast. Well, so Morris's idea was that with every month's issue for a full year, there would be this half-page ad that would follow, again, this is number, this is about number 8 of 9, or 8 of 12. And so that they were used there in an intent to bring people to California and to stay at the Hotel Del Monte. Again, similar, different reproductions of those images. They were used repeatedly, for different purposes. And I love this. This is a piece that never saw publication, but in Joe's notes, so it's a draft for him of something that he wrote in pencil, short articles on roads and trails of the rugged coast route of the San Simeon Carmel Road, from time of early Spaniards to this building of the present road. So that would have been about Highway 1 that runs through Big Sur and goes down to Cambria and then up to the Carmel area. And so again, oftentimes he did things on spec and they didn't necessarily pay off. Again, two more postcards featuring his work and the 2 different images of his work, but they were created to sell as postcards. And the image on the right still exists in a courtyard in Carmel. The image on the right is still there in part, but within the last year, this figure of Father Serra was removed to avoid the potential of it being vandalized in what has been called dark cancel culture. And so it is no longer, the shrine, if you will, is still there, but the figure is gone. And then again, wonderful examples of bartering. The owner of the Carmel Dairy, Earl Graff, employed Joe to do numerous items for him. We have a cardboard milk carton. We have a glass decorated milk bottle. I will throw out the little side anecdote that I tried numerous times to photograph the milk bottle, putting little styrofoam beads in it, putting white paper in it. Well, of course, what was best to put in it was milk. These are 2 murals that Joe did for the dairy in Carmel. And this was all a barter situation. So in exchange for his artwork, Joe got food for the family. He got milk, he got cheese, he got butter, and probably the kids could go in and have ice cream if they wanted it. Here's another example of one of the murals he did, and a Christmas card that he did on the right, plus calendars. And what we have on the left is a large piece of mat board, if you will, that Joe did his original designs on. So he goes through and there's the 12 images, and those would have been the visuals for the calendar pages. And he did that. This is original black ink art. And then you see how it was changed or developed so that it can become a calendar page. Another Christmas card for the dairy. Right down the street is the Pine Inn. Again, he did this piece for them. And then he did family Christmas cards. So if you were lucky enough to be on the family mailing list, you would have received one of these each year as the family Christmas card. And there's probably 10 to 15 different years worth of these in the archive. He became good friends with the owner of Pop Ernst, who owned a seafood restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf in Monterey. He did the artwork for that, along with another artist, Armin Hansen. And this we see here, we see a menu on the left, and then we see a postcard on the right. And then I just want to bring us a little bit more into current times. So again, here is Joe's image on the left of his Sweetheart of the Rodeo, or Evolution of the Cowboy. It sort of has 2 names, but the Byrds used that image with permission for their Sweetheart of the Rodeo album. Levi's commissioned this, and most of this now is after Joe has passed away. So these are arrangements that Joe Jr. made with the various entities. Levi's used this, and there was a time when you could go into any store that sold Levi's jeans, and this would be on the wall somewhere. Another advertising piece, this would have been on a telephone pole with Joe's image there at the top. Very currently, and this, I don't know if this falls into ephemera or not, but this is a woven patch that was, someone worked out a licensing agreement with me, and they produced this, and the idea was that you would sew it on the back of a jacket or something like that. And our local county fair has used Joe's work 5 times now out of about the last 8 years as their entire visual component for advertising. And you saw these as posters, you saw them on sweatshirts, you saw them on the side of the public buses. They were all over town. Here's a couple more examples. The one on the left is a calendar that did not end up being printed, but it was sort of a first idea. And here's this year's, which they've already decided to use Joe's, even though the fair is not until August, but this will be the visual for this year's fair. So you're getting a sneak preview of that. Joe did some wonderful drawings for a local family, the Earharts, who owned a camp, Douglas Ranch Camps. And so Joe did the illustrations for that. And then this is a more modern piece. Again, Joe's art used to advertise exhibits of his work. and a folded map. And I will date myself by saying that if I had really been thinking, this would have been an app. It would not have been a map, a folded paper map. However, my idea was that it's something that fit in your glove compartment of your car. You could drive around to all the sites in Monterey County where Joe's artwork is in public places, and you could follow it along as you drove. And so it certainly works that way, but nowadays it would be an app. It wouldn't have been a paper product. And this is a more elaborate map of Joe's work throughout the United States. This was designed by a cartographer by the name of Nigel Holmes. And this is actually is a full-size poster with, on one side is a beautiful depiction of where the sites are. And then on the flip side, it's done in text and with addresses and short descriptions of all of the work in public places. This actually has been updated 4 times now. So it's in its 4th edition. As we've discovered new things, we've changed it and have sold out the previous edition. And there we go. That's a better example of what I was just describing. I have to say, one of the true joys for me of the time I've spent with this is meeting people like Nigel, and who is an expert in his field and loves Joe Mora. And so whenever he does, whenever I come to him and say, hey, Nigel, I got an idea, or I need something, he always says yes. He just, it's just a pleasure to have gotten to know him. Well, and of course, we have to find Joe's artwork on beer bottles and on the cardboard as well. Interestingly enough, this the beer bottle label was brought to my attention by someone else who knows of Joe's work and happened to see it in a bar and said, oh, did you know about that? And I didn't. And so that brings up the whole phenomenon of rights and copyrights and public domain and things, which is a pretty interesting topic. I did not know this was happening, and I am the one who usually gives the licensing agreements. And so I got in touch with the folks at the brewery, and I just said, hey, it would have been nice if you'd asked and stuff. And they were very apologetic. They said, oh, yes, of course. They did pay me the modest fee I asked and stuff. And what I always look for and love is it's got Joe's name on it. So there's that connection. And oftentimes Joe's work is presented, but without his name. And that's one of the reasons he's not as well known, I think, as he should be, because people don't have an identifier. And then more recently, and this is kind of a nice follow-up, the image on the left, the Desert Rose Band, is a band of Chris Hillman is the sort of head of that band. Well, Chris Hillman was in the Byrds. And so I think Chris was responsible for the Byrds seeking permission to use Joe's work on their album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, because Chris rides rodeo himself. And he's continued as a musician long past the Byrds, but he has continued to reach out to me to use Joe's artwork on other pieces, such as this poster. And then, and this is pretty cool, and again, it goes along with people I've met, the district attorney in Monterey County wanted to use an image of Joe's on her stationery and actually on her seal. So each new district attorney that comes along can change their seal. The figure in the middle there is Justice, and that's based on a piece that Joe did on the Monterey County Courthouse. So she wanted to reuse that image as part of her seal. And of course I said yes. The little restaurant at the courthouse was named Joe's Cafe in honor of Joe because he did all the decorative elements on the building. In honor of that, I went ahead and did this coaster. So that's the front and the back of the coaster. Very recently, we just had a wonderful printing printing day, if you will, at the International Printing Museum in Carson, California. We took Joe's original artwork. In some cases, we used blocks that went back to his day. In other cases, we made some blocks and then did some printing using his art. So these are bookmarks. There was also stationery and a couple of prints of his from his original plates. And there you go. And I didn't pay any attention to the time, which I apologize for. But there's the ephemeral world of Joe Mora.
Well, Peter, this has been the most interesting presentation. I know you, yesterday you made a comment to me that it would be nice if we could get Joe Mora greater exposure across the country. You've done a masterful job of that today. We've got people from all over the country watching your presentation. We've got lots of observations, some questions. One thing that I'll say is that if I were you, I would have played off Joe Mora's bartering qualities, and I would have bartered with the beer folks, and had a yearly supply of their beer. But that's me. So let me begin by one of the observations that was made has to do with the evolution of Joe Mora's style. When you look at those early drawings of him, they're kind of reminiscent of Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth, and then you see some of those early sculptures. They look like Frederick Remington, that sort of thing. So the question here is there an evolution in his style? Does he develop a kind of signature style that is Joe Mora? Because as your presentation went on, I started noticing this is a Joe Mora. I could spot a Joe Mora.
Well, I definitely agree, and I do think that there is an evolution of his style, and I was negligent in not drawing the full circle about that thought, because in the beginning, when I showed you that 1903 calendar and I mentioned that there was kind of a roughness to those images, well, if you think back to the more recent images I showed you, like the posters for the fair, his whole style softens is a good way to describe it. And I attribute that to a couple of things, but mostly that he got married and he had children. And I think that and he was a totally devoted father. And he loved his kids, he loved his wife. They had a wonderful family. And as Joe got older and then as he had children, I think his style definitely softened. And having said that, you still could recognize it as Joe Mora's work. And that is pretty consistently the case. And people do come to me every so often. In fact, it happened within the last week. And somebody will say, I found this image. Do you think it was Joe Mora? And I'm usually pretty confident in saying yes or no. And both things happen. I've had things brought to me in the last few years. It's part of what I still love about this, is people find things that I didn't know existed. And there's three other Joe Mora aficionados, and the four of us you put it together and you get a pretty complete picture of who Joe was and what he did. But, there are times when we find something we didn't know existed, and we're just, it's so exciting, because he was very prolific. I mean, he created a lot of material, and that's what's in the archive. And there's a little tangent to what your question was, but Joe Mora's archive now resides with the Monterey History and Art Association. And exactly a year ago today, the papers were signed to make that possible. And before that, they belonged to the family. And so for many, many years, I worked on behalf of the family, and I've continued in this last year to volunteer for Monterey History and Art. But there was a wonderful family connection between the Mora family and History and Art. In fact, Joe's daughter, Patty, was a member. It's a membership organization that goes back to 1931. And so they had a wonderful relationship. They already had a good collection of Joe's work, and we just added the archive to it.
Well, picking up on your comment about his work softening, the detail of his maps is just incredible. And I was reminded, if you know the art of Ivan Albright, who did these incredible detailed canvases, but of these bizarre kinds of subjects, you don't have that in Joe Mora's work at all. And someone else commented about the fact of Maxfield Parrish. Maxfield Parrish was constantly painting murals to pay off his bar bill and his unpaid hotel bills. Joe Mora is doing it to support his family.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
That's a wonderful thing. Here's another question. Was Mora, did he have, apart from his father, did he have any formal art training, or was he entirely self-taught?
He did go to art school. I'm not sure I mentioned he grew up on the East Coast. So, and the family moved around based on work for Domingo, his father. So they spent time in Boston, in New Jersey, in New York. And Joe went through typical grade school and then did do some study at Chase Art School and the Art League in New York. So he did have some formal school training. But again, he was, having a brother who was as talented as was, and his father, he learned a lot from them too.
Yeah. Here's another question, and I'm interested in this as well. Did he ever write about his work or talk about his work?
Not as much as I would have liked.
Yeah.
And the irony is that this is a person who is an author. I mean, he has penned some wonderful books, that two of which are still benchmarks, 70 years after he wrote them. Trail Dust and Saddle Leather and Californios are fantastic reference books about the American West. And he kept journals, wonderful journals. But again, once he got married and had kids, he didn't spend his time quite that way anymore in terms of journal keeping. It happened more when he was a bachelor. And the frustration with his journals and letters, he wrote tons and tons of letters, but the frustration with those is that there's very little self-reflection. And that's what you would long for as a researcher, for him to say, oh, here's why I did this, and here's how this evolved. And there's little snippets of it, but there's not as much as I would like. And so a lot of the writing is, well, I put on my shoes this morning and had hot cocoa and then fed the mules and, stuff. It's a little more detailed like that. But
most artists will tell you, you deduce what you want from what I've written, painted, or scored. Well, I would love to go on, and I'm certain our audience would love to hear more, but these are ephemerists, and they are champing at the bit to get to the virtual ephemera fair. So I think we should conclude. And I will conclude by saying that to pick up on Joe Mora's pictorial maps, you have given us a wonderfully pictorial introduction to Joe Mora. And thank you very, very much for your time and your presentation, Peter. Well, it's been wonderful.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.